Hi, Rock. I'm glad to be with you today as we continue to explore how John's account of Jesus and the Samaritan woman might be inviting us to new sources of life in our series Drink. We're in the middle of the liturgical season of Lent, a time where Christians might intentionally pick up or put down a habit in order to be more present to Jesus and learn how to love and trust him more. In some traditions, folks will sacrifice something in order to be in solidarity with Christ in suffering. However, whatever reasons people pick up or put something down, it's been questioned whether we do that to actually learn to love God more or just to make ourselves feel better. Is Lent just another self-improvement project wrapped up in religious trappings? I'll be honest, Lent sort of snuck up on me this year. So when Pastor Walt asked if I was going to take up a practice for Lent, I realized I hadn't thought about anything. I just felt like I was moving from one thing to the next, trying to keep all of the spinning plates in the air going. Personal stuff, family stuff, work stuff. It just doesn't stop. I didn't have time for another checklist item, so I thought, maybe I'll give up alcohol. It's not that hard for me, and I think I could lose some weight by doing that. Really, it's just a checklist item that I can control, and it can't hurt, so why not? I wasn't really thinking about what was getting in between me and being present to God. So I told Walt, I think I'm going to go sober for Lent. He shared that he was thinking about doing the same and then gave some really thoughtful response about why. And it was clear that this was about growing in love and trust of God. I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, me too. Yeah, but not really, because clearly I was just in this for self-improvement. The fact is, I haven't really missed alcohol. If I would have taken some time to be open to the Holy Spirit, I might have noticed what God has been inviting me to. And it's only when I've had issues with sleeping recently that I've had to stop and pay attention. This is brand new for me. I've never had problems with sleeping, but in the last 6 months or so, I felt my heart racing and my mind spinning from one topic to the next. It had gotten to the point where I was dreading going to bed because I was so afraid that I would just lay awake staring at the ceiling all night, only to catch a few hours between 2 and 4:30 a.m. And the thing about being a person who's naturally high energy, I can fool a lot of people, including myself, into thinking that I'm doing okay when I'm not. I don't know if people around me would assume that I'm experiencing pretty overwhelming anxiety. I can still contribute in meetings and I can still churn out projects. I still dream and serve and read. These are all things that I love about my life and my job. And at their best, these things help me live into the freedom that Christ promises and offers. But when I couldn't sleep and when my mind and heart were racing, I didn't feel free. I felt awful. I wondered, were there things that I was ignoring? Things that couldn't be measured by success at work or by completing the checklist of health? Because honestly, I was doing all the right things. I was working out. I wasn't drinking. I was journaling my thoughts and meeting with my spiritual director. I didn't feel like I was overworking because I was keeping my day off and I was only having one evening meeting per week. I was checking all the boxes, but still I was missing joy and wholeness in my life. Joy in things like my workouts. Were they actually fun for me anymore? Did I enjoy playing with my kids or connecting with my husband and my friends in laughter? And given all of the other things going on in my personal and work life, honestly, no, I wasn't enjoying those things. I didn't actually have energy for all of those life-giving things. Instead, all I could do was distract myself with things that were pill substitutes in order to just feel relief. It sounded easier to just play a mindless game on my phone or watch reruns of shows to check out or have a cheap laugh. Maybe at some point I'd get through this season and have space for that other stuff that brings real life, but now, no, I just needed to get through. So yeah, I know I need help. I've been going through the motions and getting a lot done, but actually ignoring what was missing for the sake of surviving. Because that's what it feels like. Getting from one thing to the next, holding on a little longer. Sure, I haven't been dying, but I don't think that I've been living. I need to get a life. Can you resonate with that? The idea that your life is just surviving all the time. Just got to make it through the day or the week. Just got to make it through this test, this meeting, or this semester. I got to get through this product launch or the LSAT or this family dinner, and then I can start living. Some of you might be wondering if you need to get a life too. Now, before you pull out this self-help checklist and identify how you can fix the problem, maybe we should stop to consider why we've run into these problems in the first place. There's an HBO show right now called Euphoria. It's been called the best show and the worst one out right now, actually for the same reasons. Characterized as a millennial's revisionist fantasy of high school, all of the characters in the show are wrestling with these intense personal struggles, and all of the characters are just struggling to survive. Like most high school dramas, many of their stories are over-exaggerated, but when it first came out, parents were alarmed. Could students really be struggling with drug addictions the way that Rue was, or with violent relationships like Nate? Aren't these problems too grown up or exaggerated? And really, isn't this a terrible influence on children? Now, to be clear, the target audience of this show is not children. Perhaps it struck such a chord with adults that watch it because it is disturbing to see children suffer such trauma. We don't want that for kids. They still have their whole lives ahead of them. We want Rue to get sober, and we want Nate to learn to love himself and others well. We can see when they have made choices like drug use or choosing violence, they're not going to be healed. They're just going to prolong their suffering. We don't want these for these kids. We want them to get a life. But these characters and others that we might think of in other art forms are relatable to us because we recognize what people do in order to survive when there aren't any other options left. That's actually in our wiring. Cognitive scientists estimate that 90% of our reactions are formed in the cognitive unconscious, where our brains instantaneously make a decision about if we're safe or not, based on previous experiences. Out of these split-second decisions, our brains provide what the next step should be. Our histories, experiences, and relationships will all help form our brain's foundation for making decisions about what's safe for us. But remember, they aren't able to step back and determine if it's actually true. For example, I have an irrational fear of lakefish. For those of you that don't know, lakefish genuinely are not life-threatening to a person. But one summer I was snorkeling on a sunken ship in Lake Michigan, and this big northern pike swam out behind a pillar, and I screamed and swam so fast to the dinghy that we were diving off. I have no idea where that fish went to, but to this day I will tell you I will not swim in lake water that is murky. I need to see those puppies. I mean, what doesn't make sense, though, about this irrational fear is that I will swim off Cape Cod no problem, even though it is more likely that I would encounter a shark that might accidentally bite me there. But my mind has characterized that this encounter with a pike is going to be more threatening. And so it's created this definition of what a safe behavior is based off of that. For me, I can just choose to not snorkel on that wreck anymore. It doesn't actually impact anything in my day-to-day life. But what if the thing that was unsafe for you happens in that day-to-day life? What happens if you struggle with housing or food security? If your partner or parent is abusive in any form? If your body is disparaged in society for not being good enough or worthy of respect? Well, then leaving the house every day could be an act of being unsafe. 49% of women don't feel safe walking alone. 41% of trans people have been attacked or harassed at least once in the past 5 years. 25% of Asian Americans in the past few months have feared that they will be attacked because of their race or ethnicity. About 20% of Black and Native American people felt the same. For those folks, even an act of leaving the house can feel like you are putting your safety at risk. How can you get a life if you can't even live it? You can't complete a checklist item to change your skin color or your access to food or income. Sometimes, if you are in that situation, all you might be able to do is survive. And for all of us, The last 2 years have been this constant cycle of things that we can't change or control. Suddenly, even if you've never been scared of walking out your door, you might have taken more precautions in order to stay safe. And things just keep coming. The following is a list of the things that Americans were most fearful of in the last 2 years. And this doesn't even include the recent threat of nuclear war with Russia. We're just going to sit here for a beat so you can take some of this in. Friends, I just want to acknowledge that every single one of you has experienced at least one traumatic event in the last 2 years. Our brains have been altered in ways that we don't fully understand yet, and they change to try to keep us safe in a world that has felt more dangerous than ever. But how many of us, perhaps like what I'm realizing in myself, have just been surviving off of quick hits that can hold us over to make it past the next crisis? Sure, we can look at people like Rue who have drug or alcohol addictions and see how those hits give them space to check out from the reality of how hard life is, but I've wondered if I have been employing quick hits in my life that can be just as destructive. Medicine and society have helped us identify alcohol and drug abuse as addictions that offer these quick hits that help us cope. And they're these shallow pools of water that don't offer what we need to quench our real thirsts, but they do enough, just enough, to trick us into thinking that they're doing the job. But just because drugs or alcohol don't have a hold on me doesn't mean I'm not relying on other things that are just as shallow. Things like escaping into situations I can control when everything else feels too big to handle. My impulse to anxiety and the actions that I take as a result give me this temporary illusion of control in a situation that feels beyond my control. Instead of trusting God with situations I can't control, like trying to buy a house in this market, it's easier to throw myself into work. Instead of being present to God's heart for my kids and investing in them when I don't know how it's going to end with them, well, it's easier to connect with friends who don't need a lot from me. Instead of sharing in God's grief over what's been lost over the last 2 years, it's easier to watch reruns of Buffy, where I know how it all ends with a neat bow. Instead of making me feel better, my reactions to control out of anxiety makes me feel ultimately even more out of control. Yeah, I'm not addicted to a substance, but my reliance on things that let me avoid being present are impacting everything in my life. Because some things about my life don't feel safe and secure. My sleep, my family, and my relationship with God are all being impacted. I need to get a life. We're going to take a quick break here to share in the chat or with people around you. If you're by yourself today, consider jotting down some thoughts and intentionally reflecting with someone else later. Welcome back. I wonder in our text today if Jesus was actually inviting this woman to get a life. John's gospel is full of all of these statements that let us know that Jesus was God, and that the purpose of telling any of the stories in John is so that we may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing, we may have life in his name. Jesus' ministry was about telling people that they needed to get a life and then showing what that could be like. Jesus starts his public ministry in Cana, where we see him offer life that was abundant. At the temple in Jerusalem, Jesus offers life that was just. With Nicodemus, one of the religious elite, he offers a life that could be bound not by legalism, but that it was free and eternal. So when we get to this text, we have to ask, what is it about this encounter that would give us a clue about the kind of life that Jesus would offer? We've talked a lot about why it was significant that the life Jesus had invited folks to included the Samaritans, but I want to introduce you to a way of reading this passage that might be new to you. In the Bible, people and events can often have both a literal and symbolic meaning, especially when it comes to the ministry of Jesus. Some scholars say that while this may have been a literal encounter between this woman and Jesus, there's an additional way of reading it where Jesus is a representative of all of Israel, and this woman is a representative of all of Samaria. This makes Jesus' statement about all of her husbands a little more confusing. How could a whole nation have had multiple partners? What would a nation need to do in order to be faithful to God and experience full life in this context? Jesus was Jewish, and from a Jewish perspective, Samaria had wedded itself to false gods after their return from Assyrian captivity. In their history, the king of Assyria had replaced the Israelites in Samaria with people from 5 other countries. Those 5 countries worshipped 5 different gods in addition to Yahweh, the God of Israel. So from Jesus' perspective, Samaria's worship of Yahweh was tainted by false worship. And so even the husband that she now has, the God of Israel, well, that wasn't really her husband. Her messy and broken relationships made her a perfect representative of the messy and broken relationship that Samaria had with God. This marriage imagery is really powerful here. Wells were a common place for meeting your spouse in the Old Testament, and they were meeting at Jacob's well, a place of their common ancestry. Jesus, as a representative of God and Israel, is meeting Samaria at a place where marriage covenants are made. A marriage covenant carries a lot of weight and trust. You're meant to be able to rely on your partner and grow in full life together. In the Old Testament, the prophets would refer to Israel as being an unfaithful spouse who couldn't keep their covenant promises to God and continued to reject God. Look at this text from Jeremiah. When will you stop running? When will you stop panting after other gods? But you say, save your breath. I'm in love with these foreign gods, and I can't stop loving them now. That was Israel. But God, who had been faithful and kept promises throughout all of Israel's history, continued to be rejected by Israel, who couldn't keep those same promises in return. Instead, they were running everywhere, looking everywhere else for life, instead of to God, who promised to give that back to them. So every time they realized that these other gods couldn't give them that life, they'd run back to God. Please, please take us back. When I've been reflecting on the places that I run to when I need life, I realize it's easier to run to these false gods. Israel would run to them in the Old Testament, and Samaria had attached themselves to them over and over again. For me right now, these are gods of control or gods of distraction. The thing about these gods is that they are actually pretty effective in getting me what I want. They let me ignore the pain and the fear so that I can feel better. But they are dry wells. They can't even deliver on what they promised, much less offer any water that can lead to life. These gods isolate us from people who love us for who God made us to be. They isolate us from healing and from being freed from fear. Yet, like Israel and like Samaria, we keep going back to them because they are easier to access than a God we don't know how to look for, hear from, or be with. But Jesus, when Jesus encounters this woman, when he encounters Samaria, the true and living God, this life-giving, abundant well of water is present. Jesus is God in flesh, and he is offering her life. No more scooping muddy water from these shallow pools. No more looking to find God in the temple or on the mountain. No. Jesus is offering her wholeness, peace, and life. Do you want to get a life? He asks her. Come, be with me. I am that life. In my sleepless, anxiety-filled spaces, this is the sort of encounter that I needed. It's the sort of encounter that I have learned so much from people in recovery about. There's an honesty and a humility that's embodied in someone who can name and accept their limits. People in recovery from addiction are people who have realized the false promises of these God substitutes. They promised distraction, but they actually delivered addiction and obsession. They promised control, but caused their lives to spiral out of control and hurt entire communities. But in the acceptance of their limits and a releasing of these false gods, the fears that once drove a person in recovery to survive through substances, those fears actually don't control them anymore. Out of acceptance, they can be more present daily to living a more full life. For those of us who haven't been in a program or haven't acknowledged the gods that we run to for life, this can be really hard. Our society is not one that values weakness of any kind. We all assume that we are or can be better than average. We can be strong, be the fixer, be seen as competent. I confess, friends, that these are all lies that are so easy for me to believe. And when I'm working so hard to be strong or competent, I can't actually pay attention to the ways that I'm reacting out of fear and self-protection that isn't necessary. Kind of like when I'm being irrationally scared of lakefish. First, friends, we have to start by dealing with whether or not we think we have a problem. Have we been trying to do a lot of things in life to make it, but never actually arrived at a full life? How do we numb out, distract ourselves, or limit ourselves from realizing what's going on? Think about that for a second. Which dry wells do you tend to turn to when your soul is thirsty? Are the solutions that we work out for ourselves or that false gods have promised never delivered? Maybe it's time that we try to get a life. If we decide that that's true, we secondly have to decide if God is worth trusting. Can we be honest about that? Can we accept our limits and live with the reality of living with limits means we're willing to trust that God is capable of handling all of the other things that we cannot? It's scary. It's why I'm wrestling with this, even though I have been a witness to God's faithfulness in my life over and over again. But it's so easy to forget. And there is a lot that is clamoring to try and take care of us. But we've seen how all of those false gods come with their empty promises. We're still left just surviving. But if God is faithful, if that's true, then that changes everything. So lastly, if God is who God claims to be, then it actually frees me up to be who I am, with all of my complexities and my limits. So taking an inventory of who you are can help you name your limits, your gifts, and why you might run to something else other than God when you're scared. Everything that makes you you, your experience of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, and religious tradition impacts how you relate to God. Your family and your relational history do too. Call it your emotional biography. It describes your relational history both in and out of the family and how that impacts you. I'm not saying that our histories are our destinies, but in order to go somewhere new, we have to identify where we are starting. It's sort of like clarifying our internal GPS. If we start by growing in our awareness of ourselves, it will facilitate the difficult process of changing our automatic survival behaviors and learning new, healthier ones. It will help us know which direction we should move towards in choosing life. If you've never done this before, you could start with meeting with a therapist, a pastor, or a friend whose relationship with God you trust. We aren't the same, but we can help you explore different parts of your history with you, and then start a conversation about how your history might be making your present more about surviving than living. Head to our website or talk to a pastor today to start that process. We'd be honored to walk with you. Another helpful tool that we use as High Rock pastors is the Enneagram. We've all been discipled by Doug and Adele Calhoun, who are incredible pastors in their own right and are certified Enneagram trainers. Unlike similar tools, the way that the Calhouns use the Enneagram is to help us move towards a more clear understanding of the gap that exists between our healthy and unhealthy selves, and how each of us might continue to grow in spiritual maturity out of who God has made us. They're running a workshop on using the Enneagram as a tool for transformation on March 26th of 2022. So you can sign up on their website and see when their next event might be, if you can do that. Lastly, I want to encourage us to practice sharing in a community. If you're in a small group, this is a great thing to spend time processing together. Can you name the things that you've clung to, the things that you've depended on for survival only to be disappointed? This act of confessing our limits to one another invites the community to remind us of God's trustworthy character and then to offer God's grace for the journey. This is what I've been confessing to my colleagues this week. It felt awful to have to confess that I wasn't sleeping. I felt weak. I don't really want their pity because I know that they are under a ton of pressure too. But I actually received care and compassion. And with the help of people who are working with me, I can be reminded that God is already ahead of us. And then I can let go. I can let go of trying to fight the housing market. I can let go of trying to control timelines and deadlines. I just need to be present to what God is already doing and feel the invitation to live. Friends, the woman at the well was living a life that was surviving through clinging to men who never delivered what they promised. Peace, security, love, joy. She was scraping by and she was getting little hits here and there, but they couldn't sustain her life. Likewise, Samaria was clinging to false gods that never delivered what they promised. But everything changed when this woman encounters God in the person of Jesus Christ and was offered real life. As she left her jar at the well, we see that she accepted this life. She left behind the things that she had clung to for power and purpose. She chooses abundant life, and it transforms her whole community. This just wasn't a promise for her, but it was for all of Samaria and actually for all of us. Over the course of our lives, we will have so many opportunities to choose that life with Christ, this life that can transform us and the world around us. This isn't a one-time thing, but it's in these everyday moments where we can choose to trust Christ. I want that for me. I want to be able to sleep. I want to be present in my relationship with God and to the people around me. I have experienced how that sort of relationship can change everything, and I want that for my life. And I want our community to actually be known for being honest about our limits and for inviting others to be honest about theirs too. Could you imagine what that would be like for someone who was a part of our church? That you didn't have to put on airs or have it all together to be with us? If as a community we owned our limits, perhaps we could be a place where God was found to be trustworthy and doing greater things than any of us could hope or imagine. That is life, and it is life that our world needs. Thanks be to God, the giver of all life. Amen.